This week, we are going to look at the 2 reasons for the artistic structure in Genesis. Last week, we saw how Genesis is organized into 10 sections, all of which begin with this phrase, "These are the generations of," and then a person's name. And we also saw that the authors in the Bible take as much care with organizing their books as with telling the stories contained in the books. And this week we are going to look at some of that meaning stuffed into the very structure of the books. And we are going to look at 2 of those things in Genesis. The first thing is we are going to look at something about the main character. And then second, we are going to look at something about the main theme. Now, last week when we were looking at the organization of Genesis into 10 sections, I left something out. And that is that not all of these 10 sections are stories. You see, Moses alternates genres, and he alternates from stories to genealogies. So it looks something like this. So why would Moses use genealogies? Now, unfortunately, many people, when they hear genealogies, think, I know what those are. Those are boring list of names and numbers. No. That's not what genealogies are, at least not in the Bible. In the Bible, genealogies are just as artistic piece of craft as the stories. And we're going to have a whole video when we come to Genesis chapter 5 just on genealogies. But today, why does Moses use genealogies? And why does he use them so much? Well, he uses them because of... That's right. He uses them because of Star Wars. No, not exactly. But Star Wars can teach us something about genealogies. And think about this. So imagine you have a task of writing a work that you have to cover a lot of time, hundreds, thousands, millions of years, but in a short number of words. If you had to do that, what would be the tools, the literary tools available to you? One of them is the one you see in this opening crawl of Star Wars, and it is simply summary. So you can just summarize, compress in a few sentences many, many years, and that's one technique, and the biblical authors use that. But the other technique that is used is genealogy. And genealogy is a wonderful tool for pacing. You see, this gives the book of Genesis a nice cadence of fast, covering a long period of time and then slowing down in the narrative sections, focusing in on one person. Because if you have to cover such a long period of time, there are 2 problems that you can run into. On the one hand, you can be too broad and too big picture so that it doesn't actually connect to people, and you're just talking about years and nations, and it doesn't connect to people at their existential level about their real lives, hearing about individual people. And on the other hand, you could talk too much about just individual people and not actually cover the span of time that you are supposed to cover. And so switching between genealogy and narrative allows Moses to have a balanced cadence to the work. And genealogies also allow Moses to not just tell the names and the ages of these people, but to actually characterize them, to tell us about their natures, the nature of whole families. And he does interesting things with them that we'll see later. But the main reason for using genealogies is not that. The main thing the main reason why Moses uses genealogies, well, we've got to look back at that outline for a second. So take a look at this. Just notice it like a piece of artwork. What do you see? Well, you probably see that there's a pattern going on, an almost perfect pattern. Now, doesn't Moses know that people like patterns? Yes, he does. Well, then why would he disrupt this pattern at one point here in the Abraham story? Well, because he wants to disrupt our expectations at one point in the story, right? Or to put it a different way, it's not disrupting in a sense, it's focusing our attention and look at this change that's happening. You know, it's one of the most common techniques used in art. You know, in music, you call this, you have a theme and then a variation. So why would Moses want to focus our attention on the Abraham story? What changes there? Well, I told you at the beginning that he's trying to communicate something about the main character of this work of Genesis. And the main character of Genesis is not Abraham, but it's that character who is introduced in the first chapter, in the first sentence of this work. In the beginning, God. And in order to see what changes, why our attention is being focused there, we have to see what this character has done up until now. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And he creates everything during that creation week, and he creates man and woman, and he gives them some jobs to do. He says, "I want you to be fruitful and multiply. I want you to subdue and to rule," a combination of verbs reserved later for kings. And he puts them in this garden, and he says, you know, you can eat of any tree except for this one, but they see that the tree is good, and they take it. Well, then God comes and he punishes them, and part of the punishment is that he kicks them out of the garden. But it's fascinating that our narrator focuses our attention on the direction of the kicking. And he's very careful to tell us that they are kicked east. Well, that's the first sin. Sin number 2, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. God comes to punish him. And once again, the narrator specifies the direction of the exile. And once again, it's east, even further away from Eden, away from where God is. Okay, that's sin number 2. Sin number 3, in this strange episode, the sons of God see that the daughters of men are good, and they take them. Notice the echo, the allusion back to that first sin, that seeing something in good and then taking it. Sin number 3, and then judgment comes, the flood. And the judgment is a decreation, where you had waters covering the earth in the beginning, and God says, nope, we're going to bring those waters back again. We're going to bring it back to its original disordered state. This is the beginning of this pattern where you have 3 sins, the kicking of east, and then judgment. Well, what happens after the flood? Well, you have the sin of Ham, sin number 1, and then sin number 2, the Tower of Babel. And once again, the narrator is careful to specify something about the direction. And what he says there is, he says these people were from the east. And he says that they build this tower, which is a counterfeit Eden, and God comes down and he confuses their language and he disperses them. That's sin number 2. Now, in the pattern that's been set up, we are expecting third sin and then judgment. But God disrupts that pattern and he changes things. He's not going to allow his people and his world to be soiled. No, he calls Abraham to come west, back to the garden. And he also promises him some interesting things, because he says, I'm going to make you fruitful. I'm going to multiply you. Well, that was the thing that God told Adam to do in the beginning. But now God says, I am going to do that in you. And later he's going to promise, he's going to say, kings are going to come from you. Well, kingly work is what God told Abraham or Adam to do. And now God says he's going to do that in Abraham. So the change that happens is God takes this extraordinarily active role where he says, I'm going to do the very things that you, humanity, could not do. And I'm going to do them in you and through you. And this main character, this change that happens, Moses indicates it by changing the structure of the story, by changing this pattern so that the form mirrors the content, just like all great art. Next week, we're going to see the second thing that the author has stuffed into the structure, and it has to do with the main theme of Genesis. And we will see again how the Bible is art.